If there are things you want to talk about, we can talk about them. Or we can just sit.
How is transformation different than change?
I think on one level it may be just semantics, change and transformation. On a different level, if you put your question within the context of cooking, you go to Market Hall or you go to Safeway, you go to Costco, and you get a raw chicken. And you want to make it edible. And you really just have to change its structure from what it is to something that it's not yet is, And so you wash it, you spice it up, you put it in a pot, and you put it in the oven. And temperature about 400, and you let it sit there for about 2-3 hours. And when you take it out, it's no longer the way it once was. Everything about it has changed. In sociology, there is a concept, it's called total institution. And it's very much like the chicken example, in the sense that you take something that has a history, you take something that has a personality, that has thoughts and feelings, that has an I, a self, that thinks and feels and acts and has dreams and pursues things. But once in a while, it comes to you and says, I don't like who I am, and I don't like what I am, And I suppose you could make some changes to it once in a while. You could give it a moment of inspiration. You could read for it poetry, and you could sing and dance for a moment and then go back to the person that he or she has always been. But what you do is, if you want a sort of a transformation that's long-lasting, that's permanent, that's inside out, total institution is you take something and you get rid of all the freedom that it has and all the habits that, even though it wants to be and behave and think and feel the way it has always, you remove that freedom from it. And every time it comes out to repeat the old ways, there is an intense reprimand. It gets punished. And sometimes it doesn't even desire to bring out the old habits because it gets punished internally because of the judgments of the others. And so you allow it to sit there in that environment, kind of like the chicken in the oven. And it gets cooked from the inside. And when it comes out, it's very, 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 very different. It can no longer go back to the way it once was. The problem with, I think, change and transformation, if you're talking about once in a while, it's not a problem. I think you can just use the words change and transformation interchangeably. If you want something lasting, if you want to change the very foundation of it, it's very, 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 very different, and it could be devastating, it could be damaging. There is nothing wrong with transforming your life for a day. It's not going to impact your marriage. It's not going to impact the way you are with your kids. It's not going to impact your job. But if you have a life, and a life that's full, to transform it, not a life as you and a family, but you individually outside the family. If that change goes on for more than 2, 3, 4, 5 days, you're going to experience a good amount of friction. You and your husband or your wife and the kids and the way you are with yourself and all the guilt that comes about, where you want to go back to the old self and be the same person for your husband and for your kids, and you realize it's just not possible. You know how, like, people who are married and they fall in love with another, and in as much as they want to just walk away from this kind of thing that has reminded them of something, they want to just forget all about it and go back to the old life, and they realize, it's what we call ashaqah in Arabic. It's like this binding weed, this emotion that just wraps itself around you. It wraps around your emotions, wraps around your history, wraps around your mind, and little by little everything withers, and it says, I don't really care about your husband or your wife, I don't care about your life. All I care is I want to survive, like all living organisms. This love that is now grown inside you, it's not going to go away very easily. And you realize as this part of you is being transformed and it grows stronger and more powerful, it begins to leak into other areas of life. And then it becomes unmanageable unless you're really, 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 really good at, keeping the stuff that lives in Caesar or Rome in this part of your life, and this other part where it's a bit more creative or a lot more creative in this other part of your life. And these two parts can never mix. They can never come face to face because they just don't mesh well. I think when you talk about change and transformation, there is something that's important to understand about life. There is a part of us that needs the physical life, you know, and there is this other mysterious parts that desires creativity. I mean, for the lack of a better word, it wants the soul to come out, have wings, and just fly. It wants to leave everything behind. It's a very strange kind of place to be as a sort of organism, that we are. That the moment you become passionate, you realize you're just not digestible for society. And the moment where society confirms you, likes you, accepts you, you want to vomit. There is something about you that just grows to dislike what you've become. I think all human beings have this innate desire to change because life really just sucks the life out of them. I mean, you work 9 to 5 and you come home exhausted. You're married and you have children and that exhausts you. And you have to deal with 1,001 different just human everyday regular issues. And after a while you say, yuck, I just want to walk away from the whole thing. It's one of the things that you encounter in the Christian Desert Fathers. They just hate everything that's down here. So all of us desire change. Okay. Now, it's like anything else in life where you want to get married, but you don't know the price you have to pay. And none of us are ever sat down by our parents or by an elder to tell us, the kind of negatives and positives of relationships. All of us fantasize about having children, but no one really sits us down to tell us, again, the negatives and positives. We are filled with fantasies. All we kind of fantasize is, I want to leave this life behind and be transformed. Maybe you've read a passage by Rumi, or maybe T.S. Eliot. It doesn't really matter. Maybe you've read the life of Jesus and you say, or Socrates, and say, I want to live like that. And it's no different than maybe watching the movie English Patient. I mean, it's a wonderful, romantic movie that, inspires you on so many different levels. And you walk away from the theater and you say, that's the kind of a life I want to have, So there is a good part of us that desires to kind of just walk away from life. But we don't know the impact of walking away, You want to have kids, but you have no idea how it's going to benefit your life and in what ways it's going to destroy your life. But the fantasy is there. Now, since no one can be the cause of their own transformation, you always need someone from the outside. There are these, I think, rare and very exceptional human beings who have certain experiences. There are certain things about them that kind of very easily they're able to walk away from life. I don't know how they do it. It's kind of like, this kind of last section, since you guys were talking about the book Siddhartha, where, he goes looking for his son. And he looks into the water smiles at him, he smiles at the water, he begins to remember all these things about his father. And I suppose every human being out there who's a parent, coming to realize that eventually every kid has to figure things out on their own, and all of a sudden he has this detachment about him, and he goes back and he says, well, no one can reach another human being, and hopefully the right environment will appear where this person, whether it's my son, my husband, my wife, a stranger, maybe life will just knock on their door when the time is right, and maybe the door inside them will open and they will look at this particular event and something about them will wake up and they'll return home, whatever that may mean, that home may be. So to some extent, all of us desire to live a Harry Potter life, a life that's filled with magic. Then there is the person who has the power to create that transformation. Okay. Now, there are a couple of things that can happen. You can be transformed by someone, or at least that person can create some environments for you where you can experience some changes or transformations. Some can be short-lived, some can have a long life. I think if the person is a novice, they're going to be very, very excited because they've inspired you, and because you follow them, and because you listen to them, and because you love them. And that's enough for them to keep inspiring you until one day you go to them and you say, my life is falling apart. And they say, well, that's great. You have chosen the city of gold as opposed to the city of Caesar. If on the other hand, I think you have encountered someone who is a bit more mature, a bit more seasoned, I think they're going to move through this idea of change and transformation enormously cautiously. We have someone very close to us who was diagnosed recently with breast cancer. And so she's going through chemo right now. And so every time she does the chemo, for 1 week, it's like everything about her and her life turns upside down. There is so much pain. She vomits all the time. She's just in a bad shape. And so whenever someone calls her and says they want to come for a visit, she says, no, I can't afford getting sick. I can't afford you being sick without really knowing, coming to my house and getting me more sick. And I think someone who understands some of the negatives, damages, the negative impacts caused by this idea of change and transformation, move through this particular thing very, very cautiously, very slowly, very gradually. And the moment they come to realize that the pressure is becoming too much, they let go of the pressure, they release it so you can go back to your life. So I suppose if I was to just do a cliff note version of this, it would be all of us in this room desire transformation, desire change, because I think life has a tendency of just putting all of us into sleep. I think Gurdjieff was right on so many different levels. From the moment you wake up to the time you go to bed, there are so many things you have to do to keep your physical life going. The job that you need to kind of keep, the relationships that you need to keep, the food you need to cook, the shoppings you need to do. If you add everything together, you realize you really don't have brain space for anything else. Once in a while, just wake up in a lousy, grouchy mood and you want to fight everyone because you have no idea what's happening to your life. This is not what you signed up for, and yet this is where you are. So that's the first thing. All of us want change. And all of us, unfortunately, want total transformation. That we want our life to be changed from metal to gold. Okay? It's kind of like these ridiculous, stupid 18-year-olds who fall in love and they get married at the age of 19. They don't understand anything about life. They have no money, no education, no parents. They have no support system. They get married. 2, 3 months later, they have like 5 kids, and 2 years later, they divorce. And that life is not fixable from that point on. I mean, how the hell do you deal with these 5 kids now who are not going to be used like ping pong balls, 1 week here, 1 week there? So you have just damaged goods on your hand for the rest of your life, okay? So with any desire for change comes a constellation of desires, fantasies. You kind of have this idea in your head that I'm going to get a job, I'm going to make some money, I'm going to save that money, I'm going to buy myself a car, a house, a this, a that, and you don't really understand that in this particular culture, this culture does not allow any money to be in your savings account, especially when you're young and stupid. Okay? But you have fantasies nevertheless. So anyone who desires change has a lot of fantasies, and most of those fantasies are unexamined. They are raw. They are childish. They are foolish, but we have them nevertheless. Okay. Now, there is a part in us, I think, that's full of life, and there is a part in us that is hungry to come to life. Okay. Now, the part that's really, really hungry, what usually happens is, if Ross has to compete with Marshalls, and if Ross has to compete with Macy's and Nordstrom Racks and all these different stores, the spiritual market is no different. In other words, there are all these different teachers, and they all have these stores, and in their stores they have their own little goods, okay? And they know that there are a lot of hungry people out there. I mean, look at all the books in this house, okay? So there are lots of hungry people out there, especially in our age, in the 21st century, where there are lots of things that's just wrong about life. And people suffer from mental health at a very, very young age, and everybody's life is kind of just rotting from inside. And everybody desires some sort of a magic to walk into their life and change them. And so I think initially what happens is all these so-called teachers out there are telling you that you should live your best life. I mean, one of the most educated so-called gurus of the 21st century is Jordan Peterson. And he has these tiny little clips where he comes out and says, why do you live this kind of a life? Throw this life away. And, kind of like Nike ad, you can do it and all that. Okay. If you encounter, and if you don't, fall victim to a charlatan, and if you're not inspired in the wrong way, and if your intentions have been cleansed, by the person you're working with, the best way, and I'm not talking about an intoxicated way of change, the way like Rumi was transformed, or the way Babatar was transformed, regular, normal people like us. Someone looks at you and sees that you're married and you have children. And they also look at you and they realize, well, you're not 20, you're like 45 or 50, okay? You're getting up there. And they also realize that you have children, and these kids are young. You also understand the devastation of friction between parents and its impact on children, okay? And God forbid if they divorce, right? You understand all of those things. So what you do is you create a good amount of tension for this person who desires to change. You give them books to read, you give them exercises to observe, and then you release the tension. You allow them to go back into life. Okay? Because the lion and the lamb laying together, because you need to really be able to manage both lives. And initially it's going to be very, very difficult. There are going to be many times where you're going to go to the person you're working with and say, I hate my wife, or I hate my husband, and I hate my kids, and I hate my life, and I hate this, and I hate that, and I want to walk away from the whole thing, unlike the Buddha walking into the forest. Okay? Now, not very many of us are Mozarts, or the Buddhas, or the Jesuses, or the Socrates. Okay? We are just very, very normal people, victimized, brutalized by life. We're just looking for a moment to come up, breathe deeply this clean air, just to be reminded of how it used to feel, and then go back down to life. None of us, I don't think, are ever desiring to go through this complete and total transformation where you're just a regular chap and all of a sudden you become a Mozart. That's not what we want. Okay? At least, I hope that's not what usually people want. And so, I think the best way to move through this is, you read the dialogues of Plato where you grow wings and you fly to the sun, you feel its warmth, and then you look down and there is your husband, your wife, and your kids, and you kind of feel guilty, you feel bad for having left them, and it's a good guilt to have. You don't want to be like the Buddha, completely detached. That's just a ridiculous way of being for us. And so you come down and you go back to your life. Is it true that you're going to be remembering how it was being close to the sun? Yes. How wonderful it was to be solitary? Yes. Do you enjoy coming back down here, working with tables and chairs and people who you don't like and you have nothing in common, and their language, don't mesh well, there is little understanding, it's all responsibilities you want to avoid, but you understand them, you understand the reasons why you have to just continue pushing this wheel. So, and I don't really know where you can go to find these teachers. I really think in many ways it's just luck. Some people are just unlucky. They run into people and, the student becomes really excited, kind of like they get drunk, and then they make lousy decisions about their life. They leave their husbands or wives and their kids and their jobs, and they go after some carrot, and it may work for them. I don't really know. All I know is that life is quite dangerous. It's vicious. If you make, the wrong move, you may struggle for the rest of your life, and it's really not worth it to kind of just move through life foolishly, just because you're drunk with some ridiculous idea that you've read in the New Testament. It's kind of like you have a teacher and he or she sees you being engaged in life and they say, why don't you go and read the Gospel of Matthew and tell me how the disciples felt when they encountered Jesus, and you do. And you report back to the teacher saying, yes, I read that particular couple of verses, and it said that the brothers threw down their nets, left their wives and their kids and their father and their mother, and just followed Jesus, and that's what I want to do. And the truth is, that particular teacher had you read that particular scripture, those verses, to manipulate the way you think and feel, so you could follow him or her. Because they just want attention, because they want relevance, they want significance, If on the other hand you're working with someone, who's been sick quite often, And they know that in sickness you need help, in old age you need help, that you need to be good to your kids because eventually they're going to be your cane, they're going to be your crutches, you're going to need them, they're going to help you walk. We were talking with Stacy earlier. I asked her, she visits all these people who are like close to death. Do they have any visitors? And she says, no, most of them, nobody ever visits them. Someone as insightful and reflective as Krishnamurti on his deathbed, on many, many occasions, he would always say, what the hell did I do wrong in my life to be suffering so much, because he was always just physically very sick, always. And I think anyways, the point I suppose I'm trying to make without rambling on and on and on ridiculously is I listen to these Persian podcasts about Rumi and Shams, and I listen to some of these YouTube teachers and some of these books, and they somehow try to shove this really exotic and romanticized story of Rumi and Shams down my throat. That find the teacher, and when you gaze into his eyes or her eyes, something about you will be changed, and that's your Shams, that's your teacher. And then throw away your wife or your husband, throw away your life, throw away your job, fall in love with them, pursue them, do ABCD for them. And I think it's a very sick way to approach this idea of change and transformation. All I know is that the life of an alcoholic is very interesting. I've never drank, but the way I imagine someone slowly becoming an alcoholic is, if you have a 9-to-5 job and your life is tough, you just need release. You're not a painter, you're not a musician, you're not like Mike Tyson who can box, you're just a regular chap. And the American culture is not a philosophical culture, so that's the only way you release tension. You just drink. And before you know it, you begin to lose what little good there was in your life. And and you live out your days in a very, very angry way. But no one really asks you why you drink. So you become a very lonely alcoholic. As Richard Burton would say, it's always November, it's always raining, it's always dark, you're always like standing in a corner by yourself. And once in a while, there are these glimpses that an alcoholic has that I want to quit, I want to change my life, I'm tired of this. And I think this is what happens whenever any of us desire to change. There is this tipping point where there is so much trash inside you, and it has reached your max, whether that particular hour, that particular day, or just maybe your entire life, the life that you've lived. You say, you know what, I've been with the kids for 5 hours or 2 hours or a minute, and they keep screaming, and I'm exhausted. I just need 2 minutes to myself, just to empty the trash bin and go back clean, empty again, so I can handle another 5 hours of screaming, And so whenever you want to change anything, you have no choice but to be confronted with old habits, old ways of just doing things, you know. And so you're going to relapse. You're going to be good for 2 days and you're going to be going back to the old ways for 2-3 weeks. You're going to cry, you're going to repent, you're going to have all this guilt inside you. You're going to bang your head against the wall because you realize you don't have a strong will, that you're weak, you're incompetent, thoughts of suicide may enter. And then you look for a support system. And that support system has to be there around you, you know, until the person who's guiding the AA meeting slowly begins to live inside you. You begin to hear his voice or her voice on a daily basis, 20, 30, 40, 50 times a day. You know, you're going to have dreams about this person. I mean, that's your support system. And after going back and forth, wrestling for many months and then years, you can finally say, I've been sober for about 2 months or 3 months or 4 months. But you do very much like what other people do, which is you continue to read books, even though you have your PhD in philosophy. You continue to go to AA Center. You continue to go to the meetings. You want the reminder, you know. You want to make sure you don't forget, because that's what life does to you. Life forces you to forget. And what little change you made, it can be destroyed in a minute by life. So, good change and transformation takes place very gradually and very cautiously and mindfully and reflectively. You know, in how these old cultures used to work, which was, you go to your mom and you say, Mom, I've fallen in love with Joe. And your mom said, what?
Who's Joe?
Joe is some ridiculous guy. And your mom slaps you and says, you know, an emotion that came to you so quickly will go away more quickly than you can imagine. And the flip side is, you know, one day you go home and there's a guy sitting on the sofa and you ask your mom, well, who's that chap? And your mom says, well, that's the guy you're going to get married to. And you say, well, I don't really like the way he looks. I don't like his face. You know, he looks a little old. What's wrong with you? Why can't you find me some guy who's like good looking? And your mom looks at you and says, well, you know, he's really good for your life. And you know, it's an environment where you don't really have much of a say. So you guys get married. So your sister falls in love, right? And over time she comes to you and understand that she made the wrong choice. And she divorces after 5 years. You, on the other hand, who didn't like this kid, we were forced into this relationship. And 5 years later you realize, you know, you're completely in love with this man because he's reflective, he's mature, he's responsible, he's exactly what you needed. So if change happens overnight, it really isn't very good. You know, it really needs to simmer, needs to cook a low temperature for a long time. And it's kind of like, you know, the doubting aspect of all of this we talked about. You have to doubt. You have to doubt what you're doing. You have to doubt the instructions given to you by another. You have to doubt everything. And it's kind of like the hammer that cleanses your perception, your intuition, your feelings. And the rest of it is just luck. You know. You know, I think Plato may have been right in many ways, that all these books create all these images in this cave, Daughter of Fire. It's a great book. but it's a book that should be read by the right people. I don't know who the right people are. All I know is that all of us are tired of the sort of life that we are living. All of us are tired by the people in our lives, by the forces of life. And this book all of a sudden comes in, and it's kind of like Genesis, God breathes into this dust, and all of a sudden something about you comes to life. You read Daughter of Fire, a woman very much like you and I, who's looking for some magic to walk into his or her life. And there is Bai Sahib. And so anyone who has a turban, who has a long beard, who wears a curtain, and who says to you, well, I've read the Upanishads, and has a sitar and plays and sings and has a relatively nice voice, you say, yes, I think I have found my teacher. And these are the fake artists that we fall victim to, and our lives get destroyed because of them. So, I was young when I met Hussein. And the sort of changes that Hussein made in me, it didn't come with any physical costs, in the sense that I didn't have a job, I wasn't in a relationship, there was nothing for me to give up,
Are you talking, when you said are you talking about you or a random person again?
It's me and a random person.
So you were the invisible friend?
I do have an invisible friend. Don't we all?
She's there?
Huh? It's right there. Only I can see him, wearing red with two big eyes right in front. Something really interesting happened. After about 6-7 months of being around Hussein, I remember one of my friends coming to me saying a couple of things about Hussein and about this new group that he had encountered. So what little information he gave me about Hussein placed me in a space of doubt. I went to the meeting, but I looked at Hussein differently, and I felt differently about Hussein. And I said, okay, I'm not going to go to the meetings anymore. So I went to this new place. And man, that place was exotic. They would give us these special outfits to wear. And these outfits, if they found you worthy, they would ask you to stay after the meeting, and you would stay, and they would give you an emblem. And then they would give you like one of those, the ridiculous headscarves. They had this picture of the teacher who was deceased on a cushion. Two guys would always come to the, front of the room dressed in white, and they looked like prophets, with the long beards, and they would first sing, and then they would give a sermon, and then they would sing again, and then the lights would turn on, they would be given dates and a glass of tea, and then we would go home. It's like when you have a date and he or she takes you to a place where the candles are lit and the lights are dim and there are like flowers everywhere, and they create a space that doesn't exist in like real everyday life. And so I said, man, this is the place I want to be in. I want this exotic environment. I like the way they sing. When you go to Hussein, what does he do? He just talks and talks and talks. And whenever you ask a question, he looks at you and says, are you stupid? And I don't want anyone to embarrass me like that, especially in front of like my friends. this place would respect you, you know. And so I like that. And you know what they did? Almost near the end of every meeting, they would say, our teacher has published a brand new book and we accept donations. And we're talking about the 1980s where things were so expensive. Money had so much value. I mean, it wasn't like today. And so, I mean, they look at you and say, well, would you like a book? Well, you can't say no. You say, sure, I'd like a book. Would you like volume 1 or volume 1, 2, 3, and 4? I said, well, can I have all 4 volumes? Every book was like $60, $70. And all of a sudden you realize you go in, you sing a little, they give you some tea, some dates, and you end up spending like, you know, $5,000 for books. And you read the books, you can't even understand them because it's just full of nonsense. But the environment had you, and that's how they milked, took advantage of, you know, their people. And now it has turned into like a Costco. You know, they have a center in Canada, a center in Australia, a center in various places in, you know, US. So, I'm sorry, Abby. You asked a difficult question and I'm just saying ridiculous things. You know, in the past, I think maybe a couple of years teaching, I haven't had, I don't think, a single student who comes to the office to ask questions about change and transformation. For some strange reason, something about me just stops people from asking those questions. And part of it really has to do with the enormous difficulty of changing someone from what they are to something they currently are not. Because their assumption is that they can go home, they can read, they can sit, and if they do A, B, C, D for a couple of days or a couple of weeks or a couple of months, they will change. That's actually not true. The parts where you have to do things on your own is like you spend 10 years with your teacher, then your teacher says, go away. From that point on, now you can sit and do things on your own and learn from your own mistakes, you know, and encourage yourself to do better. You have the tools now. But for the first like 10, 15 years, if you're not damaged, what happens is you as a student have no power to do anything. You're far too incompetent. The person you're working with, they have to do everything for you. Everything. You know. And so when you realize the amount of time it takes, energy it takes, that what you have to sacrifice, what you have to give up, you know, to spend like 10 minutes with someone, knowing full well that 10 minutes is going to be eaten up by vultures the moment they leave your office or the moment they leave the classroom. After a while you say no. And you wait and you wait and you wait and you say, maybe something about me will change where I will leave my office door open, welcome anyone who desires change, and I will work with them. Or maybe one day I will walk into a classroom or the streets and I will look at someone and I say, oh my God, there is something profoundly interesting about this person. And if the feelings are mutual, then these two people can come together and work with another for a number of weeks or months or years, and then they can part ways, because it's kind of like parenthood in many ways. I mean, it's like your child coming to you saying, "I think I can cook now," just because they have seen you do a couple of things. You say, "No, you can't do anything. I need to cook for you," and you realize that you as a mother have to do everything for this kid, and they can change themselves. It's true, they can, after a good amount of discipline and just mimicking. Maybe when they get to be 10, 15, 20, then they can maybe do things on their own. But until then, they have no choice but to be dependent on you. And I think when you're young and when you desire to change, you read these great books with great characters, and you say, I don't think Plato ever felt the way I feel. I don't think Irina Tweedy ever doubted the way I doubt. And so you try to kind of be these people, but you fail to realize that you're not them. So you put so much pressure on yourself. You get depressed for all the wrong reasons. You feel guilty for all the wrong reasons. I remember, I would read Tazkiratul Awliya, a book that was written by Attar. It had the lives of all these Sufi saints, And just to give you like a ridiculous example, so you read it's the month of Ramadan where people fast. And so you have these stories where the guy says, I don't want to fall asleep and I don't want to miss my prayer. So you know what? I'm just going to sleep on the snow. It doesn't matter if I freeze to death, but I want to be uncomfortable so I can wake up and then I can stand to pray. So you read this stuff and they have such power over you. And so what you do is you say, okay, well, if this guy did it around the 8th century, I can certainly do it in the 20th century. So, the heater is on, but you put some plastic over the vent to make sure no heat comes into your room. You paint your room black. You remove the bed from your room. You kind of just sleep on the floor and you say, okay, well, I may fall asleep. In order to avoid falling asleep, maybe I should just have no blankets, no sheets on me. And that's what you do. Because you want to emulate these people, because something about them is so fantastic and so grand and so exotic. And it's a wonderful mirror to have, But what you encounter after reading a couple more pages is that, well, the guy sits, the guy fasts, the guy prays, and then he has a nice dream or a nice experience. Okay? And you assume that if this is what you do, well, that's going to be the fruit of all of your effort. And nothing comes your way. You put in so much and you get nothing. And so it's always good, I suppose, to just have a teacher so they can kind of smack you once in a while to make sure that you don't think too much of yourself and what you want to do and where you want to go. Does that? I'm sorry for rambling on.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there is this. I don't know much about Hermann Hesse, who wrote Siddhartha. All I know is that, you know, a guy who has 3 marriages, you know,
Why did he marry somebody 3 times?
he loved them so much he married them 3 times. That he's quite troubled. It doesn't mean it's a bad thing. I suppose kind of like Alan Watts, he was looking for something he couldn't have down here. There is a scene in the book where Siddhartha meets the Buddha. He says, I don't really care for teachings anymore. I'm tired of listening to people talk. And you, Buddha, you know, who thinks that you can do ABCD for everyone. The truth is, there is something you're missing, and that's very profound. Siddhartha tells the Buddha. He doesn't really, it's not in the book, but I'm guessing that this is the way it should have been. That people are looking for an experience that kind of can transform them, you know, into a butterfly. And he looks at the Buddha and says, you know, close your eyes for a moment. Go back to that moment where the veils of Maya were removed from you, that you could see God or truth or whatever it was that you experienced. You know, kind of like what Plato says, the guy walks out of the cave, looks at the sun, but the sun is too bright, averts his eyes. He says, that's what I want. I want that experience, the one that you had. Can you tell it to me? Can you tell me what that looks like, how it feels? If you can put that into language, I will follow you. He doesn't, again, say those things. So just in case you haven't read the book, if you go to read the book in hopes of finding those things, it's not in the book. But someone like me, if I'm as hungry as Siddhartha, and I've read enough books, and I've heard enough teachers talk about the same stupid stuff, you know, the truth is, I want that moment where Muhammad was sitting in this cave and something opened up and something touched him, like the angel Gabriel came down and said, read, you know. And all these other experiences where these teachers just, you know, the burning bush of Moses and whatever the hell Jesus experienced in the desert, you know. I want that particular moment. I think sometimes it's not a bad thing to not want that, but just see it and appreciate it in someone who has it. You know, if you read the Gospel of John, what you have is, you know, why the hell would you want to go into the desert and spend 20, 30 years, you know, wanting an experience? Just look at me. That's what he says in the Gospel of John. I and the Father are one and the same. And I think it's the spiritual greed that Siddhartha had, that he himself wanted to be the Buddha and become the Buddha. He wanted that experience. He had lost the ability to look at this man and worship him, you know. I can't tell you, when I think back now, how wonderful it was. And it's these things you don't really get until you just no longer have them. To be so excited to go to a saint's house a few times a week, to sit there for like 10 hours each time, and to go to gatherings, and you keep looking at his cup to see if his cup is empty, and then if it is, you're competing with Hussein, because at any time he's going to say, Hussein, can I get you some tea? I mean, your father is sitting right there, your mother is sitting right there, you could ask them if they want some tea, but no, you don't really care about your parents. You ask him. And there are like 50 people sitting there. You're just a kid. And of all these people who are sitting there, you just look at one guy and you just ask this one guy that I have noticed that your cup is empty. Can I take your cup into the kitchen and fill it with some tea and give it back to you? Once you lose that, there is nothing down here that can inspire you the way you were inspired for about 10 years. Once you have a book that captures you, like Daughter of Fire, any book, it doesn't really matter. One of the nice things about the Harry Potter movies, I don't know if you've seen them or not. First are like 8 parts or 10 parts, and each movie is about like 10 hours. Okay. And there's just so many things going on in each of these movies that I think if you were to watch these 10 movies over and over and over again, it would be new, as if you've never watched them before. It's like there is something about these movies that can always capture your interest. It never gets old, But once it does, you realize, well, are there any other movies that can be as magical as Harry Potter? Lucky for us, we found it. Lord of the Rings. And you watch that a few times. And then you realize that's it, it's finished. The culture does not give you any other movies that can bring magic into your life. And I think if you hang out with anything that is for you magical, changes you in some shape or form, if you hang out with that long enough time, it will impact your life. Not in a good way. Unless your husband speaks the same language as the magic. Your kids understand magic. Or everything like a fine-tuned engine. If on the other hand, you have tasted magic and you take that magic to your husband, and your husband looks at you and says, what the hell are you talking about? Why are you like this? And I think it's a good thing to always be able to hide things. Anyway, so, yeah. Sorry. Cassie, anything?
Oh, there were 2 things, but I don't. Maybe I can just share them and maybe you can talk about whichever is interesting. The first was that maybe you could elaborate a little more on. Sometimes when you talk about the Epic of Gilgamesh, you talk about the three kinds of wrestling between them. And I think the first was that Gilgamesh wrestles with Enkidu with the desire or intent to try to defeat him. And then the second was that he wrestles with Enkidu simply because he desires to be around him. And then the third was that he wrestles with him with the desire that Enkidu win. So that was one question. The other was just in listening to In Search of the Miraculous, Gurdjieff talks to Ouspensky about the importance of sacrificing one's fantasies. I'm assuming fantasies about oneself and one's life. So that was the other question, if either of those are interesting.
I don't think I can talk about the Gilgamesh question. One of the things that happened in, I think, early 20th century, and I think it was something that came out of France, if I'm not mistaken, is called literary criticism. And their main, really, philosophy is so I am reading, let's just say, a verse from Hafiz or a verse from Rumi. And someone says, well, can you tell me what that verse means or what it's saying? So the assumption, I suppose, that people have is if I was to give commentary about what Rumi is talking about, that I have access to the mind of Rumi. Now, the mind of Rumi has culture in it, has history in it, has emotions in it, has an set of experiences I just don't have access to, you know. And so what this particular branch does or speaks of is that, listen, the only thing you can really do is create an intimate relationship with this verse that you've read of Rumi, and then you're giving a commentary based on your experience, not Rumi's, okay? So when we talk about Gilgamesh, or your question about Gilgamesh, the truth is, I think, first, I've never really read the epic front to back. And I think I kind of just look at it as a guy who's having a spiritual journey, and I piece the stuff together because it reminds me of anyone who wants to go on a spiritual quest. These are the things that they have to go through. So as sometimes I talk about Gilgamesh or other people, the truth is sometimes you tap into these creative ways of looking at a certain story. And once that particular episode is finished and someone comes to you and says, well, you know, in class you said A, B, C, D, can you explain what that means? You say, well, I have no idea what you're talking about. I said that? So when you were talking about the three wrestling that Gilgamesh had with Enkidu, I don't remember, you know, when I said that, if I said that, and if I did, what exactly I meant by those things, you know. And I think it's something that while I was talking, I was just making up stuff. Does some of the ways you approach ideas, if they're creative enough, will it excite, inspire your audience? Yes. Are they in the story itself? No. Is it the way you're approaching the story? Yeah. The point I'm trying to make is I can't really remember the 3 wrestling matches, so I can't really talk about it. But if all of a sudden my mood, says, why don't you just talk about that stuff and just wing it and see where it goes, and maybe we can talk about it. In regards to Gurdjieff sacrificing stuff, there are a couple of things about Gurdjieff, but before we talk about that, let me just tell you one tiny story from my own life, which was, when you're young, as I was very young once, you want to look like the dervishes of the past, And so I remember my friends always telling me, Amir, what is wrong with you? I would say. And I remember we were sitting, it was me, Hussein, Mehrdad, and Manucher, who ended his life because he fell in love and that didn't work out. And we heard of this just a few years ago that he committed suicide. But I remember we were sitting having some food and he looks at me and says, Amir, why do you look like this? You didn't look like this always. When we went to school, you looked really good. And you're a nice looking guy. You have a beard now, you don't cut your hair, you wear baggy clothes. What's wrong with you? And what he didn't really understand is I'm reading these books and I'm interacting with this man who has exposed me to these ideas. And these are like traditional, ancient ideas. And you want to live out these ideas. And the way you live out these ideas as a young kid, you want to look like a hippie, a Persian hippie that looks like a dervish, So you grow your beard long and you wear this long black jacket every single day, wherever you go. And everything about your life just begins to change. You don't talk as much, you don't laugh as much, you don't tell jokes as much, you don't go out as much, you don't interact with anyone as much. And so your friends notice. Now, I had gone to Hussein's meeting that night, just the way, I looked with the beard and long hair and all that. Hussein was very, very, very allergic to those things. He didn't like mimicry. He didn't enjoy anyone pretending to be something that they were not. He wanted people to live a very normal life, be invisible in the sense that they need to look like all the other people on the outside, because you don't want attention, especially when you're a novice. You get attention, you will like the attention, and then you will lose the intentions of why you did this in the first place, we had a friend, anyways, so I remember that night he looks at me and says, Amir, listen, you need to shave. I said, really? I like my beard, And I think way back then when he told me that, I felt as if he was telling me to shave because he couldn't grow his beard as nice as I could. Mine was like straight, it was just kind of lay on my face, and his was bushy, very messy looking. But regardless, of what I thought or what I felt as to what he was telling me, I said, okay, I'll shave. But you need to understand, it wasn't just like hair on my face. This hair on my face was an expression of my desire to be a dervish, to be a Sufi, to live a certain lifestyle, to look a certain way. So there were all these things that Hussein was telling me to shave off. So That night, because I was so tired, I went to Merdad's house and I slept there. And from Merdad's house, I go to the car wash. Hussein comes to the car wash in the morning. And I think he came there, you know, to make sure that I did as he asked. And he looks at me and says, "You still look the same." I tried to explain to him the reason why I couldn't shave was because I, stayed at Meredith's house and I didn't have access to, razor and all that. And he shook his head very, very disappointedly. And as always, he would tell me, "Amir, you will never amount to anything." That was like his favorite line. And I would say, "Yes, I know. I will never amount to anything." And, you will never amount to anything by the time you fall in love with your teacher and by the time he makes you feel like crap, it doesn't really mean anything anymore because you don't amount to anything. Everything about your life has become a mess. It's no longer manageable. You wake up in a bad mood, you live out your day in a bad mood, and you go to sleep in a bad mood. And you're just not digestible to yourself or anyone else. And it's interesting because now when I have students who want to dress a certain way and speak a certain way and look a certain way, I always tell them, "Listen, why don't you wear a suit and a tie? What's wrong with you? Why do you have to look this way?" So this idea of sacrifice, we become attached to things, all sorts of things. There can be attachments to things on the outside, things on the inside. It's Sigmund Freud had argued that the only way change is possible, I guess many different ways, but one of the ways that change is possible is when you fall in love with your therapist. The problem in falling in love with a therapist is that the task of a therapist is to bring to the surface all the traumas that you had pushed down. And every time the trauma comes up, you hate the trauma and you hate the person who has forced you in some shape or form to bring the trauma to the surface, where you see them and then you feel and then you become angry and you can't control anything. And you have to do this over and over and over again until you look at your therapist and say, "Thank you." Because for a long time every time it comes up, you're going to hate this person. The point, I suppose, is you read these books and you become attached to certain ideas. These ideas have emotions behind them, fantasies behind them. It's kind of like the first couple of pages of Daughter of Fire, where she says, "I had all these ideas about yoga, I had all these ideas about meditation, what a teacher should look like, how a teacher should behave. And I came to realize that I was wrong. And that 1,000 pages of Daughter of Fire is all about that you cry because your expectations are not being met, and they're not being met because you expected one thing, but the teacher knows better, so he does the exact opposite. Until you come to a place of acceptance. There is but something you should know about Gurdjieff that I don't think you will find very many people out there like Gurdjieff. Gurdjieff understands something that most teachers, myself included, and don't really understand, which is change is not possible by talking. Change is not possible by listening. Theory, like the Spirit of God, needs to come down here, and it needs to take flesh, the form of flesh and bones. It needs to walk, and it needs to upset you. It needs to break you. It needs to walk into your physical life and have physical qualities. It needs to push you around. One of the beautiful things about Gurdjieff is that he was a hands-on teacher. He knew that. What's the use of talking about anything? You want to really understand the allegory of the cave. You walk into a classroom and sit in a classroom where there is Plato or Socrates talking about the allegory itself. And they're articulate, and they're eloquent, and they are intense, and they're passionate. And little by little you realize that your life really is in fact the allegory of the cave. You embody the allegory. And it's not like something you sit and just write a crappy 2-page essay on, where you have to present to an audience of your peers. That's just a stupid way of doing philosophy, And he was such a gift. Now here's the problem with hands-on teachers. They're always going to be misunderstood, because all of us have in our heads this idea that teachers are always supposed to turn the other cheek when they get slapped. They always should exercise compassion and forgiveness. They should kind of be softly spoken. Their passion should be very, very controlled and tamed. They should never use profanities, And Gurdjieff kind of defies all that stuff, He will not allow you to, or encourage you to continue with those ridiculous narratives as to how a teacher should be. If you want to change, if you want to transform, if you want your life to be morphed into a butterfly, well, you need to be beaten up. You need to be upset. You need to be made angry. You're going to be asked to do things that you say, why do I need to do this? This is ridiculous. This doesn't make any sense. And yet you have to do it. Now, is it true that this approach could find themselves or itself in the hands of charlatans? Yes. Is it true that some people could manipulate this particular power if they have any? Yeah. Is it also true that it may fall in the hands of someone who is perhaps not a charlatan? Yeah. Can you know who is and who isn't a charlatan? No. It's just a matter of luck, You really must have experienced something profound. And I'm not talking about these hippie spiritual stuff that people talk about. Look, if someone was to come to me and say, Amir, so can you tell me about having children? So, it's a guy or a gal asking a question. I should kind of be nice about it. Gurdjieff, on the other hand, looks at this person and says, listen, I'm going to tell you some things. They're going to be 10% positive, 90% negative. Do you want to hear it? I think Gurdjieff made himself available only to those who had the capacity to endure a lot of pain. You know, that you're willing to put your life in his hand. You know, there is this, I don't know what book it comes from. I think it's Our Lives with Mr. Gurdjieff, Olga and Thomas de Hartmann. The guy who did the music for Gurdjieff. It's like raining and Gurdjieff is driving and he's going really, really fast. And he's going very fast for one simple reason. Olga is scared of being in the car at night, especially when it's raining and the roads are slippery. And so she looks at Gurdjieff, I mean, they're sitting in the back and says, Gurdjieff, can you drive a little slower? You know, it's raining, it's dark, it's dangerous. And Gurdjieff says, sure, sure. And so he presses on the gas pedal. The poor woman says, I asked you if you could kindly slow down, you know. The car is going a little too fast. And there comes a point she screams at Gurdjieff and she demands that he stops the car, pulls over to let her out. And Thomas, you know, his account is, well, you know, if my wife gets out, I can't just stay in the car. I have to get out as well. So he gets out as well. And they're stranded in the middle of nowhere. And Gurdjieff just leaves. Turns around, comes back after 5 minutes. They get back in the car. And Olga says in their book that Gurdjieff didn't have an ounce of anger in him, despite the fact that I said all these nasty things to him. He doesn't care if you stay in his school or not. He'll give you an experience. And I suppose the best he can hope for is that you will have the capacity to endure the experience. First of all, the experience itself, and then go home and reflect on the experience and hopefully process the experience. You know? And you don't find teachers like this. They're like one of these people, I suppose, in every generation. Yeah. And you can make the sacrifices on your own, Cassie, in the sense that I can look myself in the mirror and say, I want to shave my beard. I'm far too attached. I have too many blind spots. I needed someone like Hussein, you know, who has kind of gone through all the stuff before me. And he knows the pitfalls a little bit. He says, I know why you have this beard on your face, and I know why you're wearing these long baggy jackets. I know why you're quiet and why your, you know, body language the way it is. You're trying to like mimic things that don't belong to you right now. So I need you to change your ways. If I didn't love Hussein the way I did, and way back then I didn't have the language, I wouldn't say love. I would say, well, you know, he's my teacher. I wouldn't even say that. I'm not really quite sure how I would qualify Hussein, but now I think I can sit back and say, if I didn't love him, and I would have never shaved my beard, you know. So you can't make sacrifices if you don't love someone. there are going to be these moments where some things are going to be asked, but you're at a certain state, certain moods where you love, but you also doubt. So you're stuck between the yes and the no, and the maybe, I suppose. And there isn't much you can do about those things. And it's normal to have them. There's nothing wrong with that. Hussein had a funny way of, requesting his desires to be met. He would call and say, well, come over. I said, well, my family has guests. And you say, I tell you to come over. And you say, okay, I'll be there in 5 minutes. Oh, you couldn't say no, not when he says it like that, Yeah. And most often you don't really know why you're doing it, why you should do it in the first place. And I think without really knowing at that time, you're just taking a leap of faith. Like day after day after day after day, they keep asking you to do A, B, C, D, and you keep doing them. And you don't really know if it's going to get you anywhere, and you don't even really think like that. You just say, you know what, I like this guy, I'm just going to do what he asks. And there is such a, it really does make you feel good, Last weekend I went to my parents' house in Roseville, and my mom said, Amir, can you not go to the car wash? This was like before I drove there. I said, okay, and I'm coming there for what then? Because I just saw you guys. He said, well, I need you to put some trims around the windows. I said, so you want me to like bring all these tools so I can like fix your house? Yeah, okay. So I put all the stuff, and I did it for one reason. I was such a lousy kid. If I was a father to someone like me, and Yusuf is just like me, I would have probably like killed him, And whenever Yusuf and I clash, it always reminds me of me and my parents, how they sent me to India and to America and did all sorts of things to make sure I don't become a bum, So, I put all the stuff and I go there despite being exhausted. And I spend like 6 hours doing the trims. And every time I call, they say, oh, my father especially says, your mom really, really is liking what you did to the windows. When you're making the sacrifices, you don't really understand. Time passes. You begin to make some reflections, some calculations. You go past, you go present, you go future. You hear the voice of your parents, your mom, your dad. And then you understand that your sacrifices actually paid off. You have made someone you cared for extremely happy. And you benefit as well. I would tell you more stories about other things, but I'll just stop there. But you should appreciate Gurdjieff. Not so much Gurdjieff on paper, but how he put himself in very dangerous situations to make sure that someone else can understand something. Alexis, anything? There doesn't need to be anything, I'm just asking.
You talk about, you mentioned how Gurdjieff had something special about him in respect to life down here or something. And he had these movements. Sometimes you see videos online
dervishes have this dance they do. Where do you think these things come from?
The movements.
Yeah, like is it another kind of poetry, like a gift that's given?
I don't know. I don't know how Gurdjieff got the movements. Whether he created them or learned them, I don't know where he got them from. And I can't claim to understand the movements. There is a story that Shams had told Rumi that instead of reading books and instead of praying, he should start dancing. And he should dance in this or that particular way. I don't know where Shams got them. He comes from, there's a suggestion that his father was Indian, or at least he had some Indian blood in him, and he brought some Indian tradition with him. And so he had adopted some Indian philosophy. But all those things aside, I think because Rumi enjoyed Shams's presence. He listened to what Shams was instructing. He found, I suppose, those movements in the special dance that he gave Rumi, he found them to be meaningful for him. And then one day as he was walking the market, something about him just said, you need to dance, and he began to dance. And you're talking about people who were flattening or thinning gold, and it was very expensive at that time. And the shopkeepers, who were all Rumi students, having seen Rumi performing, they said to their teachers or workers that don't stop hammering. We don't really care if the gold turns into dust. We don't care if we lose money. Just keep hammering because our teacher or Rumi is just dancing. And so I think from that point on, this dancing became customary in the Sufi tradition. Now, there is something that I think is important to understand, which is if there is someone you respect, if there is someone you love, even, let's just say, you fall in love with someone, their body, when you sit next to them, it has a different quality. At least that's how it feels for you. Okay? So whatever the meaning for these dances are, it was because first Rumi liked this man so much that he assumed that everything that he's being told by this man has a special meaning to it. And so the dancing movements also have certain alphabets that only Rumi knew, perhaps, you know. But what usually happens is that over time things get watered down. You know, there was a guy, he's dead now, he passed away some years ago. He had gone to this whirling dervishes in Turkey. He wrote about 5 books. I forget his name, this Persian guy. And so, because he knew the people in the orchestra, he knew the dancers, they agreed to meet at a certain coffee shop afterwards. So he says, I sat and I watched these people dance, it was beautiful. And then I waited for them at the coffee shop, and they all came in with suit and tie. And it was such a disappointing thing to witness, because here they are, me assuming that these are like real, genuine dervishes or Sufis, that they're not really being contaminated by Western fashion. But here they come, all looking, you know, like Englishmen. And he said, once I saw that, I walked away. And I suppose the point I'm trying to make is, I don't know what the meaning of Gurdjieff movements are. All I can tell you is that when Gurdjieff dies, he looks at these people and says, this is a mess, you guys figure it out. That the language behind the movements is a mystery, it's an enigma. I worked for a number of years with a guy who was heading the Gurdjieffian Center in California. And I tried to pay attention to all the things he was telling me. Some made sense, a lot of it just didn't make any sense. And it didn't make sense because I don't think he really understood himself. You know, even though he had written many books about this stuff and he was guiding a lot of students here in California, Australia, Canada. And so I think you should always go back to what Bhai Sahib says to Irina, that even if you love Satan, Satan will lead you to God or the thing that you're looking for, you know. The point is, do you love the hands that's giving you poison? Because if you love the hands that has poison in the cup, you will drink the poison and it'll taste like honey and it won't impact you. But you have to love it, you know. So you're asking me to deconstruct a movement tradition that comes from Gurdjieff and the dervishes, and first I don't really have the knowledge. Second, what I know about history is that something is unique, it's original. As it gets passed on, it becomes useless. It's just a shell without any meat in it. I think all teachers and all of their teachings are good while they're alive. It's good for them and the people they're working with. Once they die, everything about them should be buried too, because, you know, eventually the teaching will just be just another form of philosophy. It's just going to float somewhere. Always remember, everything is a relationship, and all relationships will eventually become casual. Your relationship with ideas are no different. Sorry. Regardless of what I said, if you are able to find, a Gurdjieffian center here, and if they're willing to teach you the movements and give you some commentary as to what these movements are, it's worth it. But you just have to kind of approach things like a scientist. You go there, you learn, and you get out. Stacy, anything?
Thank you. Could you talk about either Ali at the well? I think, is that Muhammad's cousin?
Mm-hmm.
Or when there's a recognition of a chief feature? A chief feature? Is that?
Chief feature, yeah.
Yeah, that needs to change, or at least it seems that way, and it arises through an experience of conflict. Does the person have any particular responsibility once the recognition for change appears? Or is it something that is applied to the person and it's just a matter of endurance?
I don't think chief features can ever be changed. I think, to give you an example, I am by nature an introvert. I've always been. And the sort of introvert that I am also very passive. Okay? I don't work well with other people. It's when I used to go to interviews, one of the things sometimes some committee members would ask is, well, how do you work with other departments? And just to be a little funny and sarcastic, I'd say, well, I don't work with other people. I don't like other people. I just like to be by myself. And so these are my chief features. Now, what would happen in, say, a Gurdjieffian setting is that I would be placed in a group that contains people who are extremely invasive, and they want to pull you out of yourself, drag you out, and have you engaged and involved in what they want to do. And they are talkative, and they are sarcastic, and they're rude, and whatever. And so what happens is, well, you say yes to Gurdjieff because you can't say no to him, And initially, you have the patience and the forgiveness and all the stuff that introverts have. They say, okay, you know what? I'm just going to be as patient as I possibly can to endure this hellhole. There comes a point where your capacity is full. You can no longer take it. And now you want to lash out. You want to be angry. You want to kind of find the corner and go sit and hide. But they're not going to allow you to do this. And Gurdjieff is watching you. And so what happens is, as your trash bin gets full, now the negative parts come out. And now you have a couple of options. You can either express the negative parts, the negative emotions that come up, which Gurdjieff forbids you doing this, that you can't express anything that's negative because it'll come to life and consume you, okay? And so, and you must never blame other people for the way you feel. You feel the way you feel because you want to feel the way you feel. And you have to have enough insights and enough mindfulness and awareness to know all of this stuff. So just in case you want to carry your sorry behind somewhere in the corner and cry or scream or punch someone, you kind of hold yourself together and you continue working with these people while having the conflict on the inside. And it could be the flip side, which is someone who is very engaged, very talkative, gets nervous and consequently talks all the time, is put in an environment where they need to just shut up. And every time they want to like talk, something about them or the group says, keep your mouth shut. And so the struggle begins to happen. I think one of the nice things about the struggle that takes place in combating the chief feature, at least coming to recognize and work with it, is that there is going to come a point where your training at the Gurdjieffian Center is coming to an end. Or maybe you go there from 6 in the evening to about 10 at night, right? But in the morning you have a job. And that's what Gurdjieff demanded, that people have a real life and then they come here as well, okay? And so what you encounter in everyday life is that people push your buttons. But you have to be able to keep yourself together. You have to make sure you don't fall apart, you know. So it's difficult to differentiate between chief feature, okay, something that is intrinsic to who and what you are, and experiences that have shaped you, like a certain 1 or 2 or 3 very intense emotions that have made you the person that you are. Like you married at the age of 18, things went really, really horrible, and you have vowed never to remarry again or never to be in a relationship again, okay? That's not a chief feature. That's something you have learned as a way of protecting yourself, okay? A chief feature is something you're, so to speak, born with, okay? And out of that, habits are created. This is an experience, and out of this experience, habits are created. And you could say they're almost the same. So that's the chief feature part of it. And it's usually recognized not by the person, by the teacher who's out there working. And what's interesting about your question is that it has a market value now, in the sense that if you go to Barnes and Nobles or you go to Amazon to look for books around Enneagram, most of the good books on Enneagram or typology, Gurdjieffian typology, is that they all contain sections on chief features, and they're designed for one thing. These books are mostly written for the employer, your boss. So he or she can figure out who and what you are, so they can have enough knowledge as to where they can place you that's most profitable for them and the least amount of conflict for you, because it would have an adverse reaction for the company or the group you're working with. Which is a nice little feature of the West, because everything ultimately becomes part of the market. Okay. You asked something, what was the other one?
Ali.
So Ali is the cousin of the Prophet Muhammad in the Islamic tradition. Muhammad loves Ali and Ali loves Muhammad. That's the first thing. To some extent you could say that Muhammad plays a father figure for Ali. Now, if you're in a relationship, any kind of relationship, whether you're married, have children, one of the things that you soon understand is it's not right for you to burden your kids with your issues. You may not like your husband. You don't need to tell your daughter that. You don't need to tell your son that, especially when they're little. It's a burden that you have to carry on your shoulder. Okay? Now, whenever there is pain, now when you talk about Ali, you're not talking about someone who's a lightweight. You're talking about someone who is a social reformer. You're talking about someone who is a religionist. You're also talking about someone who is a spiritual seeker as well as a spiritual teacher. So you have all these different components in one single human being. He's also married. He also has 3 kids, I think. Fatima, Hassan and Hussein, if I'm not mistaken. And he writes these lovely letters to his sons. I'm sorry, not Fatima is not. Hassan and Hussein, beautiful letters he writes to them about justice, about society, about what it means to be a human being. Now, if you want to be the carrier of all these different components, if you want to live a life of a hero for your wife, for your kids, for your prophet, for your society, for God, there are all these things that you have to carry on your shoulders. That's a huge weight to carry. Now, you also know that your daughter, who is 5 or 10, is not strong enough to carry the pain that lives inside you. And so what you do is you shut your mouth, you make sure that whenever your daughter comes home, there's always a smiling face looking at her. Okay? Because you know that your daughter deserves much better, and you don't want to contaminate your daughter with your own problems. So what you have is a man who is carrying a lot of awful things that he sees in society, in politics, in religion, in just the life of human beings. And he's learned something really interesting, that in life, ultimately you have to carry your own pain. Ultimately there is no one to help you. Ultimately you have no right to burden anyone with your hurts and wounds, because of a couple of things. First, no one can help you. Okay? In other words, if you come to me and say, I'm having a difficulty with my husband or your wife or this or that, I can give you an ear, fine, but at the end of the day, you have to go home. You have to look at your companion. You have to figure out what the hell it is that you want to do, how you want to resolve the issues. I can't do it for you. Nobody can do it for you. Okay? Having come to realize that pain has a tendency of creating this person inside you who's going to be profoundly lonely and desperate for attention. Ali embodies a human being who is mature enough to carry all sorts of burdens in a very solitary manner. He knows that no one around him in his life has the capacity to hear an ounce of weight he is carrying, so he keeps everything to himself. You know, I remember one of my friends who had lost his son. He didn't shed a tear, not a single one. He rested his shoulder to the tree with folded arms and he just looked on. Who in, the cemetery, what parent, all these parents, sure they have lost things, but they have lost watches and cars and wallets. None of them had lost a son. Okay? And all these people saw their parents die, but these are kids watching their parents die, not parents watching their kids die. Okay? Now his wife was different, but he himself, because he had gone through certain things in life, and because he loved Stoicism, because he loved Sufi philosophy, he had come to realize that first, no one understands anybody's pain. I mean, what is language really? I mean, you can't really, how much of your emotions can you put in language? Not very much. If you really want to communicate your emotions, sorrowful emotions with anyone, all you can do is shed tears. And when you shed tears, what happens? Someone simply sits next to you and watches you, maybe holds your hand, maybe gives you a hug, but that's the best they can do. Your pain is met with the silence of another human being. Okay? So, once in a while, what happens in the life of Ali is that the pain is too much, the loneliness is too much, the weight is too much. But knowing that human beings, people in his life around him can't listen, can't understand, can't carry, he goes looking for a well. And he screams into it. And the empty well echoes, And that's where he finds his relief and release and companionship, in the well. But I think, if I was to make the story a bit more human, it's really no different than Gurdjieffian philosophy, in the sense that make sure your negative emotions never manifest. And even if they force you into this space of loneliness, try to drag yourself out of it and go into a space which is very noisy, and even though it may irritate you. I mean, these are easier said than done, and it's usually best to do these things with the guidance, and instructions of someone who's really, really versed in this stuff. I'm sure, our parents, they really did their best. Mine still do. They're both still alive. I mean, my mom had cancer. I didn't even know. Breast cancer. I didn't even know. All I knew is that she would call me and say, "We're having dinner tonight with folks. Why don't you come with, Sarah and the kids? Let's have dinner." Okay. She's in the kitchen, just cooking away and cleaning and washing and all that stuff. I had no idea. And then I had no idea that she was taking these huge pills that kind of just messes up her mood, messes up her body, But to some extent, this is the way, the generation before us were created. Life is tough. There's no running water, there's no electricity, there's no medicine. You suck it up. You know, whatever your issues are, your husband is going to come home, he wants food. You know, whatever your issues are, your kids are coming home, they need to be taken somewhere to be having fun, you know, somehow. And so they would really never burden us with anything. And you need to really have a tough skin. It's something that people these days don't have it. You know, they're always like chattering about their issues on TikTok, on Facebook, on this, on that. And so the moment someone looks at them in a certain way or speaks to them in a certain way, they're easily broken. You know, especially all of us in this room who are instructors. That's how complaints come about. He said A, B, C, D, and my feelings are hurt. You know. And so one of the things, again, going back to the story of Ali, is learn how to carry your own pain without contaminating and infecting other people. You know. And even if there are people close to you who really love you, want to take care of you, keep your pain to yourself. You know. You know, forgive me. My father's 91, I think. He's never talked about old age. Now that doesn't mean that late at night he doesn't, you know, stay awake, you know, regretting certain parts of his life, being angry because he has lost certain abilities because of getting older, you know. He doesn't complain about any of those things. He carries them all by himself. And I think all parents do that, as all mothers do that for their kids. You know, and in relationships, that's what we do. We compromise, you know. We negotiate with ourselves, with our companions. But the crux of the story is have a thick enough skin to carry your own life on your shoulder. Just because you have a companion, it doesn't give you the right to dump anything on this person. They have their own issues, whether they know it or not. You know, you just carry your own stuff. It's really hard to be autonomous.